Okay, we're good. All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Building Centre for tonight's Retrofit Meets panel discussion on the theme of communities. Delighted you could all join us. I'm Laura Broderick. I'm the Head of Partnerships and Programmes here at the Building Centre. I've been working with our partners, the National Retrofit Hub, on the Retrofit 25 exhibition that hopefully some of you have had time to see upstairs this evening, and then our colleague group here to plan the events as well as deliver the exhibition. It's super exciting to be back in the seminar suites for these panel events. We delivered these in Retrofit 23 and Retrofit 24, looking very much at case studies around residential initially and then commercial, cultural and civic properties. But for this season, for Retrofit 25, we're very much addressing that systems thinking approach and the question of what's stopping us in retrofit today. So these panel discussions will take one of the 8 themes from the exhibition above and kind of take a deep dive into it and explore it with our fantastic speakers. So as I said, we're looking at Retrofit Meets Communities tonight. I'm sure lots of you got different ideas and knowledge and experiences of what communities means to you. So there will be a Q&A after the panel have each given their 10 minutes of presentation. So 4 panelists, each speaking for 10 minutes, and then audience Q&A. But just in terms of the core message around communities, we've been thinking about sharing how we might unlock the potential for community-led retrofit to transform local relationships and buildings. So that's a starting point, but the speakers we've got today all bring a breadth of experience and perspectives and delivery, working with communities directly. So you'll hear more from them, and then, as I say, we'll have time to open it up to you as the floor. The event is being recorded this evening, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if there's aspects you want to look back into or share it with your colleagues and friends, please do so. We'll get that up in a couple of weeks' time. We've also got lots of other events, so we'd encourage you to come along in the future. So let me introduce our panel in turn, and then I will be handing over to them for their presentations. So in order of speaking, we have Naomi Rubberer, who's CEO of Footwork. To introduce Footwork, it's a collaborative non-for-profit that facilitates locally led neighbourhood transformation by supporting local people across the UK to revive and steward land and buildings with their communities for the long term. So Naomi, she's a trained architect and worked for several years delivering social housing before turning her attention to the social purpose of regeneration, and continues to develop ways in which Footwork can strengthen the connections between people, places and well-being. So Naomi will be our first speaker. Helena Gosden, Associate Director at Arup, is our second speaker. Arup's Retrofit at Scale Task Force leader, Helena's role is to leverage all of Arup's expertise in building reuse, net zero carbon strategy and urban regeneration around the challenge of domestic retrofit. She leads Arup's efforts to address the system challenge of retrofit and to meet our net zero carbon commitments, whilst also seeking to deliver aggregated benefits to local communities through a place-based approach. Helena has strong relationships across the sector and is working with Naomi from Footwork as an industry mentor on one of the Footwork projects in Grimsby. Our third speaker is Kyle Buchanan. I didn't mean to do that. Who's the director of Archeo. He was founding director in a studio that specialises in housing regeneration and environmental retrofit. He leads a team of architects and designers who deliver impactful and innovative solutions for clients and end users, with a particular focus on co-design and strengthening community involvement in urban renewal. And finally, our fourth speaker is Hannah Wooler. Hannah is a qualified conservation architect and founder of Matter of Place Architects CIC. She has a special interest in heritage-based placemaking, and her community interest company has been designed to deliver best practice in this field. Hannah is passionate about the long-term holistic sustainability of the built environment, and her work is moving towards technical retrofit and advisory roles for local authorities and third sector organisations. And upstairs in the exhibition, there's an example of the community centre retrofits that she's been leading. So there are 4 speakers. I am going to pass over to Naomi to get started. As I say, it's 10 minutes per speaker and then Q&A afterwards. I just have to do a little bit of jiggery-pokery with the presentation slides, so bear with me while I do that. And we will move over to hear from Naomi. So welcome, Naomi.
Hello. This is recording, so I have to speak into it clearly at this distance. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you for the very generous introduction. So I'm here to give my perspective from footwork. My name is Naomi, as you all know, and let's dive in. It's a bit of a dramatic sketch, but I just thought I'd sort of set the scene of what we see the challenge in the world to be. And this, simply put, is where we're seeing development, regeneration, place shaping happening to communities and not alongside and with. And the implications of that, very simply put, challenge, but it's very complex, is that communities and people in places across the UK are not feeling a sense of belonging at the least, and at the worst they are feeling fragmented or displaced from the place they call home. And that simple injustice, but complex injustice, is at the heart of why we do what we do and why we've emerged into the world as a non-for-profit, as a charity 3 years ago, to come up with a hypothesis of what would an alternative model of place-making, shaping, regeneration actually look like, so that we are harnessing, holding, and nourishing those social connections between people and their place. This is a very moody sky from a community we're working with called Granville Community Kitchen, so I'm giving them credit. I think this injustice can leave you a bit frazzled, and when I came out of the system of architecture school, all 8 years and a bit of it, I was feeling a little bit angry because I'd sort of been told that I could play this role of a little bit of a godlike creator, and that my actions and activities and wacky ideas and beautiful models were helping people. And I think within sort of a few months, actually, and this was on working on Wall Street, in Brooklyn, in New York, in Chicago, in Copenhagen, I was getting lots of different insights into how practice, architecture practice, is working within, and a lot of the time trying to work against this modus operandi of top-down. But I was still feeling stifled. I was feeling personally stifled by the drawing board as my tool, and I was getting curious as to what else could we be doing to work on this hypothesis of a place-shaping model alongside and with. So the idea for footwork grew out of the mind of an incredible philanthropist, social justice, documentary maker, and architect, Claire Richards. And when I joined her 3 years ago, we started to really hone in on what could we be doing to work on this idea of a locally led model of regeneration. And who out there in the world, that local motivation, determination, appetite, ideas for their place, do we need to be alongside? It's a bit like doing the footwork on the ground. And this is one example of those groups that we've been working alongside over the last 3 years. And our challenge to ourselves is, what if we can harness this local motivation, appetite, capacity for change in their area to actually tackle the knotty local issues that exist within places? And so far, we've worked across 30 neighbourhoods, footworking alongside community leaders and groups who are trying to shape the place where they live. And I'll get on to some of these innovations and some of these ideas and the different scales of innovation we're talking about. And through footwork, through our local community anchors like local authorities, community centres, social prescribing, institutions and individuals, we're able to find these people, these community groups, and we support them with a funky strategic cuddle, which I'll also get on to describe. These community leaders are different in that what they're coming up against when they're trying to realise their idea for their place is they're coming up against the inner belly of development. I think a lot of you in this room know what that's like, because you are that resident in your place trying to shape it, or you're an architectural practice trying to work alongside communities. So these communities have a lot on their plate. The business of regeneration and planning is confusing enough as a trained architect, let alone a community leader who's completely new to this system. But they are recognizing the responsibility they are taking on and they are re-engineering the term developer for themselves. And the groups we are working with are calling themselves community asset developers, because that is the work they are doing. It is wholesale, whole-scale neighbourhood transformation, asset to asset to asset, to unlock these spaces, places, shop fronts, churches, street corners, parks, pocket parks, for community use and at best community ownership. That's their goal, and that's what unites them. They've identified a social challenge. They've recognised to address that social challenge, they're going to need to do the business of development, the business of activating and stewarding space. And alongside Footwork, we support them to do that. There's a threefold combo to our strategic cuddle. One is mentorship and strategic expertise alongside them over our time together. And I'm going to leave Helena to speak a little bit more to that. The other is just learning together. It's what it takes to know you're not alone in your isolated, knotty challenge in Colville or Plymouth or Hastings or Birmingham, but knowing there's a whole movement of you across the UK doing this work. And using platforms, the building centres, the guild halls, the spaces on our street corners to actually platform and be a voice for this work and this movement. We get together, we have a lot of fun, we come around food, we create space of warmth and safety to build trust. This is an example, if you haven't been to see it, the most phenomenal community-led project in Liverpool called Kitty's Laundrette. And it's a wicked example of how as simple an idea as a laundrette can have a catalytic impact on people, their sense of belonging, their agency to shape more than just cleaning their laundry, but actually having an impact on the transformation of the place around them. And this is this year's cohort that we're working with. I wanted to show this little snapshot of values that came out of our most recent gathering last month, because I think it speaks to what our community leaders are seeing in each other and the space they'd like to foster outside of the work they do. And every time we come together, Footwork and our peers, we're drawing on these values of fostering brave spaces that are built in trust, kindness, and equal participation, in bringing their whole selves. So not feeling they have to be that brave face or that stoic CEO in the community, but just knowing they can come, whether they're energy-filled or joy-seeking. And they're there to lift each other up, to know that they're understanding of the pain points that each other are going through, and they connect through that, and to keep those conversations going. So I mentioned the mentorship element of this strategic cuddle that Footwork's giving these community leaders over the course of a year and even beyond. And I think this is where a lot of us in this room as a profession, as a built environment community, come in. Because when we look for a future of equitable participation and the ability to actually truly shape our places, communities are going to find themselves increasingly being the developers of our neighbourhoods, of our high streets. And what does that ask of us as a profession? It asks us to be alongside. And Grimsby and Alan and Neil, I'm going to leave for Helena to touch on, but I just want to give a little snapshot into their challenge, which is, for all extents and purposes, absentee landlords in Grimsby in the West Marsh area, meaning that housing has become derelict and disrepaired. And these two incredible community innovators are taking it on themselves to become the ethical landlords of the future for that place. And Arup have stepped in to be that strategic mentor over the course of this year. I wanted to leave on an idea that's bigger than the programme. It's bigger than what Footwork does. Because I think a self-critique of our work is that we are working in depth with 10 neighbourhoods, but this is a systemic challenging affecting our whole country and in fact in many neighbourhoods around the world. So what does a systemic solution look like to this systemic challenge? And 25 established awesome, wicked community asset developers across the country got together to work out what is a systemic solution to why every neighbourhood isn't regenerating and self-generating. What's the solution to this? And I think we're on the subject of what's in the way, or, you know, what's stopping us. And their solution is to say, well, if we collectivise, if we don't see ourselves as sort of high-risk community projects in Haggerston or in Enfield, but if we actually collectivise our knowledge, if we collectivise our assets, our land, our property, we are taken seriously. We're an investable proposition, perhaps even for big capital, like pension funds and others that could flow into this collective system of work. And they are using, and we are using, the term of a mycelial network. And I don't know how many mushroom fans I have in the room. Okay, I'm getting a dodgy look, so we'll come back to that for drinks afterwards. But the way a mycelial network works under the forest floor is the constant flow of resource. Mycelial networks scope out areas of promise. They flow resource to where it's needed rather than an arbitrary flowing of it. And so this analogy for how a network of community asset developers and work can operate around the country is one we're taking very seriously. And we're now raising tens, if not millions, of pounds to come into this mycelial network of community asset developers. And the last picture has not loaded. Okay, I will leave you on this. And thank you, everyone.
Bear with me, just need to Alt-Tab myself. Okay. I don't quite know how to follow that. That's quite amazing. But that, like, energy and passion is exactly why I and colleagues in Arup have been, like, falling over ourselves to work with Footwork the last few months. I thought a bit more about this presentation today, and the more I've thought that I might kind of skip a little bit through the first few bits. So just a word of warning that might be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. But essentially, I put the first few slides in to contextualise the work that's part of the exhibition upstairs. But the much more recent and much more kind of actually human story is what I really want to focus on, and that's been our work with Footwork. So I'm Helena Gosden. As you've heard, I work at Arup. I head up our Retrofit at Scale task force, which we established about 3 years ago now, to try and consider how we can have a more positive impact on place-based decarbonisation, particularly domestic. So this slide sort of encapsulates in a nutshell what we're trying to achieve. Draw attention to that second line with the red highlight, which I think is important in the context of this conversation, because what we endeavour to combine is theoretical insight and deep understanding that comes from implementation of projects across Arup, which I will come back to. It's taken us probably the best part of 3 years, but this is our latest iteration in terms of response to the question of what do we mean by scale? I think it boils down to 3 focus areas for us. There's scaling action, doing more retrofit faster. There's scaling outcomes. Understanding and evidencing outcomes is self-reinforcing in terms of the level of action and benefits we can deliver. So thinking about how we scale those outcomes. And then scaling projects. And I've highlighted this last one because we've done quite a lot of work at central and local government level, but we recognise, as many of you in the room will do, that we can't achieve a transition solely with a top-down approach in the decarbonisation sense. We have to recognise, embrace, nurture, support and scale neighbourhood action as well. So looking at that neighbourhood lens, this is quite a detailed diagram that we developed that illustrates the system at neighbourhood scale. It appears in a report that we published. It's quite busy, but what we're trying to capture here is the interdependency of all the different interventions and infrastructure at building level, at neighbourhood scale, and also for a wider locality. And the point being that is as if you start to define a community really as anything more than an individual building, you realise that that scale starts to present additional opportunities and benefits. And the bigger and more diverse the community and the asset base, the broader the opportunity and the potential benefits that flow. Which brings me to this slide, and this, some of you who've looked around upstairs will recognise. It's the diagram that you can see and read about in the exhibition. We, in the context of the previous slide and that kind of complex system, undertook to do a piece of internally funded research about 18 months ago through our user experience design team in Arup to develop this as what's known as in the UX world as a receiver framework, which thinks about how we might segment the community to tailor an offer that is attractive to different people. Now, putting people in boxes isn't necessarily everybody's idea of a good place to start. And I think it's clear the moment that any of us started to try and sit down and put ourselves into those segments ourselves, how challenging that process can be. But we also know that it's a powerful tool that underpins a lot of brand marketing in other sectors. And I think it can be useful in testing policy, for example, and also to think about how we might package retrofit. So it's a piece of work that we're super proud of, but I come back to my opening slide because I can't deny that all of this that I've presented so far is very theoretical. And while I think we could confidently say in Arup that we bring a lot of experience in other aspects of retrofit, we did have to ask ourselves whether we could say the same about community retrofit. And I think the honest answer is no, or at least it was around 18 months or so ago. Continues to be. At this point, I will take a little bit of a step back and explain a little bit about Arup as an organisation. So we're employee-owned. Each year we reinvest a large proportion of any profit that we make into research, unpaid collaborations and partnership pro bono work. And so I think probably by most industry standards we do quite a lot of community work. Our community engagement programme actively seeks out and chooses partners, and then we look to provide technical in-kind support rather than providing sort of volunteer days. But typically this is with charity partners in the UK, abroad. But the challenge of enabling community retrofit at scale is something that we haven't really addressed through that route yet. And I was sort of reflecting on this and trying to figure out why, and this is where I got to, with the fact being that the vast majority of community groups in the UK aren't actually registered charities. They're led by brilliant volunteers, but as organisations, I feel like perhaps they're almost a little bit too granular to be visible to some of the bigger professional firms, for example, unless you happen to know someone in one, or unless you are a professional working in that firm and you're actually involved in one of those volunteer groups. So we asked ourselves how we could change this, and ideally not just for Arup, but to think about how all of our peers in the industry could start to engage with this as well. And as fate would have it, around the time of finishing this work, Sarah at the National Retrofit Hub asked us if we would like to have a meeting with Footwork, who you now know lots about. Footwork had a specific project in their 2025 cohort that they were seeking a mentor for. The project was all about retrofit, and I'm going to come back to them in a minute because they are amazing. But I think it's important to note that a lot of our first meeting with Naomi and Footwork and the National Retrofit Hub was spent discussing how we could maybe use this work as a pilot for providing community groups across the country with technical support when they need it. In this instance, Footwork is the bridge between the community innovators and, let's call them, the professionals. But we wanted to understand what we could learn that was transferable and scalable. Scale, again, being a key word. So now I get to talk about the human part. Trotted off to Grimsby in January to meet Alan and Neil at the Westmarsh Development Trust, based in the Westmarsh Community Centre. This is a photo from our first visit. We've got Alan in the middle, Neil on the right, and this is Catherine, who's one of my colleagues from our Sheffield office. Now, Alan and Neil are, as Naomi referenced, completely inspirational. They've both dedicated a large part of their working lives to this community, to the community centre and all of the outreach programmes that flow from it. It's everything from food bank to debt advice to providing heavily subsidised sports facilities for the community. It would be However, and that little prompt in the bottom, I don't know if you can see it behind the chair, but there's Hodson Architects down there, but is a prompt there for me to note that it would be remiss to say that they're not receiving support locally. I mean, their kind of commitment and their passion just shines through, and local partners have tried to do what they can, but they still face a challenge in their next project, which is to try to secure housing into ownership of the trust. So the community centre is an award that scores very highly on the indices of multiple deprivation, if that's something that you're sort of familiar with. Many of the streets are lined with very similar properties to these, and many of them are effectively derelict. Namely, had a photo of these as well. In parallel with this, there is limited council-owned property for low-income families, and those on low income are in the private rental sector with persistent uncertainty around ownership of the property and suffering no-fault evictions. I think one of the anecdotes that Neil shared was that there was one family who'd been served 6 no-fault evictions in the space of 2 years or something. That's them having to uproot and move every 3 or 4 months. It's just crazy. So in some ways, I think it's a microcosm of the situation that Peter Barber, the sort of award-winning architect, has described here on the left in this quote. There is no shortage of housing. There's an abundance of empty housing, but there is a shortage of secure quality homes. And so Alan and Neil want to work with the council to take some of those empty properties into ownership of the trust, retrofit them and make them available on a long-term secure tenancy to local families. And there's this ethical landlord model that Naomi referenced that is tried and tested, actually. East Marsh is the neighbouring ward, and they have done this with about 10 properties. But the difference here is that they want to use the rental income to continue to fund the work of the outreach programmes from the community centre, which has an impact on a much wider proportion of the community than just those individual homes. And that's the kind of real legacy that Alan and Neil hope for. So this is my final slide, yes. We've been working with Alan and Neil for about 4 months now. It would be lovely to report that everything is progressing rapidly, but the reality is that they continue to face some frustrating delays completely beyond their control. They're very resilient, they're experienced, and the community that Footwork has built around them is giving them additional strength and perspective, and we'll continue to do what we can with them. But in the spirit of answering the question of today of what's stopping us, I think I would summarise their key challenges here on the left-hand side, and it's probably reflective of community groups across the UK. Where do they start? Who do they speak to? How do they deal with the delays and lack of transparency that greet them at every turn? And where might they obtain some seed funding from, because there's only so much you can do with voluntary contributions. And so in that context, our role has been to try to mitigate this, primarily through signposting as mentors to resources that we're aware of, advocating for them through our wider network, offering, for the most part, quite basic but practical guidance around budgets, programme and risk, and recently business case development as well. I'm sure lots of us could and can do this, and as professionals, this is things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And notice also that it's nothing particularly technical at this point. But I guess my question I keep coming back to is how do we scale this? And even with Arup's ownership structure that I described to you earlier, we can't scale this much beyond 1 or 2 projects a year on a pro bono basis. We all have to turn a profit to stay in business, or we certainly definitely wouldn't be able to help. And I think also to understand how we identify those who need help. So we mentioned that there are organisations, amazing organisations such as Community Energy Pathways, who are doing brilliant things to provide community groups with resources. But from my perspective, at least, it feels like a lot of the industry is struggling to know how to engage with these community groups and how best to support them. So I'm going to conclude with my own question, which is how we connect businesses and these community groups at scale to allow us to deliver that just transition and meet our net zero commitments. in a way that is both commercially sustainable, but also provides the broadest range of access to the most communities possible. And I wonder, I wrote a little scribbled note at the end about that mycelial network. I wonder what that mycelial network looks like with industry interwoven within it. So thank you very much.
Okay. Oh no, wrong one. That should be you. Perfect. Okay.
You can spot the Mac user in the room that doesn't know how to use a PC. Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm Kyle. Thanks very much for coming out on this glorious sunny evening and spending this time in the basement with us. I think it's a good reminder today that retrofit is also about dealing with overheating as well as being too cold in the winter. So I'm Kyle. I'm a director at an architecture practice called Archeo. I just wanted to start with this very in a way, crude and simple fact, which is, I think, which describes very well the scale of the challenge that we need to undertake to be anywhere close to meeting net zero targets. So we need to retrofit 30 million homes by 2050, which is approximately 2 a minute for the next 25 years by my maths. So it's quite significant, and that's 24 hours a day. It's pretty significant. So retrofit is, as many of you will know, is a really significant technical challenge. Part of the problem is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And there are a significant number of archetypes in the UK, housing archetypes, that need to be addressed to be able to deliver at the kind of pace that we need to. But I think amongst all of the sort of technical nature of retrofit, it's also very important to remember that it is a human challenge as well. Every house is also a home, and I think more than any other sector in regeneration, retrofit has to work alongside existing residents, often very literally working on homes that people are living in. So when we're talking about retrofit, which is a term that I generally have a bit of a problem with, but I'll just keep going with it for now because it's clear. When we're talking about retrofit, we're talking about works that will have significant impacts on people's lives and on communities, and it's work that deeply affects resident communities. And getting it wrong can have really significant consequences. I don't know if anyone's read any of these particular articles, but I think the one about Evan Davis no longer being able to talk about heat pumps is pretty terrifying. I think that heat pumps are now apparently on the wrong side of the culture war and therefore too political for us to discuss in public. And I think in a way this kind of illustrates some of the challenge of not bringing people with us on retrofitting homes and on the need to improve the energy performance of our homes. So if we don't get people on board, quite simply we're not going to make progress. So this is a exhibition and series of talks about finding solutions. So one of the ways that we think is a really good way to find solutions at Archeo is to talk to people who are really on the front line. This is a little round table that we held in our office recently of people working in local authorities, in housing associations, who are really trying to deliver this stuff on the ground, as we ourselves are. But I think it's just good to open that conversation as much as possible to understand the challenges. I think there are a number of barriers. I'm just going to kind of contextualise some of the difficulties of getting residents on board. And I think in the context of particularly social housing, and I think that's where we can have a big impact immediately, in that context, there is a long history of very squeezed maintenance budgets, a long history of issues with fire safety, and I think what that has led to is a significant level of mistrust between residents and landlords. And that, combined with the fact that retrofit, as I said at the beginning, is very technical, uses a lot of technical language, I think it can feel very alienating. It can be very difficult for residents to understand what the benefit of that is. And in the previous slide, you saw somebody talking about how it would take them 20 years to pay off the council-imposed refurbishment of their homes. And I think that's a situation we just can't be in. So getting people on board can feel like a really daunting task. And overcoming that that mistrust can be really challenging. So how do we deal with that? Well, I think we're very much about practical solutions at Archeo, and so perhaps our little contribution to that discussion is to put together this retrofit co-design toolkit, and which I'll tell you a little bit about now. And the reason that we've put this together is I think that building back trust really starts with building relationships. And so how you engage with people and how you engage with residents is really important. Engagement in co-design is a specialism that our practice has developed actually over a number of years, initially working on new build social housing projects. And for anyone that doesn't know what co-design is, it's broadly speaking, it's a way of combining professional expertise with the lived experience of residents. And I think in doing that, it can be very powerful in delivering impactful solutions that really tackle real problems. The thing is that when you start working in new build housing, particularly infill housing, so working on existing estates, it very quickly becomes apparent that you can't just have the conversation about new housing. There are also significant issues in existing housing. And so I think we saw an opportunity to perhaps take some of the skills that we learn in new build housing and use them in retrofit, which is something that we've been doing for the last couple of years. Right. So the toolkit itself, I've got a copy here. I've got a few in my bag if anyone would like one later. It's quite simply structured, really. It's divided into 5 sections. I'll try and read these on the slide, because I expect you probably can't. So a clear process, giving people the pen, constructive conversations, I'll now read it on my own slide. Thank you, Laura. And empowering communities. I should know these off by heart. And I think the point about these, it is a toolkit, it's like a toolbox. The expectation is not that you would use every single one of these tools, there are also others. But it's more about thinking about suggestions of how you can have constructive conversations with residents, both during the process, but afterwards as well. So a couple of examples, the one on the bottom left here is what we call a project pattern. And really what that's about is just making visual and making clear the process through which retrofit will be done and the opportunities at which people are able to influence that process. So it's about making things visible, because I think that makes people, our experience has been that makes people feel more comfortable. We've got things like checklists as part of condition surveys. You know, how do people, what are the problems that people are experiencing in their homes? The people that live in the homes are usually the best people to tell you what's wrong with the building, actually. Things like hopes and fears exercises can just be a really good way to build trust, to show people that you're really listening, to give people an opportunity to kind of say the thing that they really want to say, that they feel is really important, that you need to hear. And then actually one of my favourites is using large-scale models to really engage with engage people in conversations. We, you know, as architects, as people working in regeneration, as construction experts, we all assume everybody knows how buildings work. Generally, they don't. I mean, actually, as an industry, we don't fully know how buildings work. That's a slightly different discussion. But yeah, people. It's really helpful to actually explain the mechanics of buildings to people as well. So as to say, we've been using this toolkit now and these methods for several years, and I'll just give you a very quick rundown of some project examples. So this is a retrofit guide that we put together for Barking and Dagenham Council for the Becontree Estate. I said that we're interested in scale. The Becontree Estate is the largest public housing scheme ever built in the world. It's about 29,000 homes. 80% of those homes are one of 3 archetypes. So there is a real opportunity to make a difference there. I mean, there are obviously other barriers as part of that. So what we did was we co-designed place-specific retrofit solutions for the estate. And really that was in kind of 2 categories: easy wins to reduce energy demands for residents, and then more advanced measures to get homes heat pump ready. And in our work and in our conversations with the steering group in particular, we actually targeted these measures at private home owners. And that was because in looking at EPCs, they were the group that actually were living in the worst conditions, interestingly. So a lot of the interventions that we're looking at, the intention is that they're both affordable and easy to do. We've used the toolkit on this project on the left with a large housing association in the Midlands to really facilitate conversation as part of a wider it used to be the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, Warmer Homes Fund now, as part of a Warmer Homes Fund funded project to really facilitate conversations between repairs and maintenance and residents, which I think is often a barrier. And then the one on the right is some work we're doing with a housing association in North London, looking at retrofitting flats on this occasion. Lots of vulnerable residents in those homes, most of them one-bed homes, and really trying to understand the issues that they're facing in their homes and the interventions that can have the most impact. Often in retrofit, you are looking at what can you do for the least amount of money that's going to have the most impact, and I think residents are often the best people to tell us that. So, ultimately though, what we need to be doing is we need to be finding solutions that work and that last. You know, we've heard stories of housing associations fitting air source heat pumps and then having to remove them again because they're too complicated to use. So we need to find systems that are straightforward for residents to deal with. We need to support residents once retrofits have occurred so that they are getting the most out of those systems. And I think ultimately residents need to feel like their homes are being upgraded as well as retrofitted. So they're seeing the benefit from day one, whether that's dealing with antisocial behaviour in the stairwell or dealing with damp and mould in the bathroom. These are all linked issues and they're all part of how people experience their homes. And ultimately, I think that is the only way that we're really going to reduce emissions from our homes is by getting people on board. So hopefully this is a little contribution towards that. Thank you.
Went for the PowerPoint in the end.
Yes,
great. Right. So that should be good. Shimmy out.
Sorry.
No?
Right, and now for a bit of an about turn, because this is seriously techie. So mine is about the work that we do, working from the premise that there is no carbon. We cannot be messing around with what we have left. We cannot be installing retrofit measures that need taking out. We need to do things once and we need to do them right. And the best way to do that is to be as informed as possible. So we've been upskilling ourselves as a practice for the last, well, since we begun, basically. So this is a project I'm talking about, which is a assessment and retrofit designs for 15 community centres for Norwich City Council. My name's Hannah Wooler. I'm the founder and creative director of Matter of Place Architects. I'm a conservation architect by trade, and I think that's really important. I come to conservation not from a background of National Trust houses. I come to conservation from an understanding that buildings that we've already built are really bloody important, and that's where I started from. I started in sustainability and trained to do conservation so that I can treat the buildings I work with well, and I think that it's embedded across architecture, but having that conservation understanding, thinking at every building from first principles, makes the decisions you make a lot, makes it easier to make the right decisions and have the processes in place for having making the right decisions. I've recently set up another company called Matter of Fact Retrofit, very specifically to take the architecture. It's really hard because I also have a problem with the word retrofit because it's the reuse and adaptation, the climate-sensitive reuse and adaptation of existing buildings, which we have done for generations. This is nothing new. What we're doing now is new learning, dependent on the climate crisis we're facing right now, but people have adapted their buildings since the beginning of time, and that's what architects do. But if you say in a lot of contexts, if you're talking about retrofit, and you say you're an architect coming to the table, people say, oh, we can't afford you. We don't want that. And actually, what they do want is what we know, but what they want is an affordable and accessible way. And so that's what Matter of Fact Retrofit does. I'm trying to bring the expertise that we have to people in a way that they can engage with them better. So the number one approach of Matter of Fact Retrofit is doing less. That is my number one thing in both retrofit and in architecture. We don't have any carbon to spare. We need to use our materials really efficiently, and to do that we need to know and only do what we know we need to do. And so that is my overall mantra for retrofit. So we were funded by Innovate UK from December 23 to December last year to develop a process in-house, which is nothing. Individually, the pieces are nothing exciting, but altogether, it gives us a really informed approach to understanding how buildings function. And we use PHPP, which is the passive house planning software. It's really well understood within our industry for designing new buildings. It's just as good for designing retrofit measures. It's underpinned by huge amounts of international research and is constantly being invested in. So it's a great resource for us to be able to bring many minds onto what we do. So we have this amazing bit of kit, which is from Build Test Solutions, which is an in situ U-value measurer. We also use LiDAR scanning, and we bring a lot of our standardised knowledge that we have from our other architecture to bear. And then we make this into graphics that allow us to communicate really complicated ideas about how buildings function, but in a way that people can engage with them. So we use the same, you'll have seen this before, or something similar. It's really important in retrofit, starting from a place of knowledge. So you only get to what we're talking about here to retrofit right down here. Right, first of all, you have to understand your building and understand what changes, understand the context of your building, the existing fabric conditions. And this is the same for any building, be it a house, be it a community centre. It's really important that people fully know their buildings. Why was it built? What was it built of? Is that a local vernacular? Is it a previous scheme of social housing? Because we're working with Norwich City Council on their archetypes. And it's so interesting looking at the previous roles of work that have come out and what that's led to for the different types of buildings that we're working with now. And it's really interesting that there are only 3 archetypes on that whole estate. We've got 14 archetypes, cover a third of Norwich City Council's social housing portfolio. So these are big problems that we're looking at, but with all of our minds, they're not undecipherable. So you have to understand your building, then look at the repair and maintenance, and this is what we were talking about before, like focus on the small wins. If you can make sure your building is in tip-top condition, you can make up to 20% energy savings just from the repair and maintenance before you've done anything else. Then we move on to simple measures, which are the kind of thing you'd be working the quick wins with your community. So looking at changing light bulbs, looking at draft proofing, and then, only then, do you get onto the retrofit, because it takes a lot of carbon and a lot of effort. And everyone who works with local communities and anyone who owns or manages a building, it's really hard. Like doing construction work to your building and having the governance in place to manage it is really hard. So to do as much as you can along that way before you get to the construction is a large part of the challenge. So I'm not going to talk about this because this is seriously techie, but PAS 2038 is a great piece of policy, national guidance, which talks about how to do retrofit on non-domestic buildings. So we use PAS 2038 to guide our processes. Again, I'm not going to talk about this. Loads of non-domestic buildings in the country. This is the process. So you start at the beginning, you identify whether it's a traditional protected building, and traditional buildings, anything built before 1920. So, well, 1919-ish, but you have to understand the building, because some buildings, there were steel frame buildings built as early as 1864, and there are still traditionally constructed buildings being built now. I built one a couple of years ago. So you have to understand what the context of your building is, put it through the right pathway, and then you get into the assessment process. And everything we're talking about here is in these top 3 steps of the process, which is how you do an intelligent assessment. So this is an example of the community centre, one of the community centres we worked on. This is Cadge Road in Norwich, and it looks like this little thing on the right, and it's lovely. And there are 3 of them are exactly the same of the 15, but 2 of them have been absolutely ruined by previous retrofit schemes, and this one hasn't. So that's why this one is here as our example. So here's all of the context. As it turns out, these buildings aren't significant, but as an architect, we can see there is something lovely about it, and you shouldn't lose that. There is a value that is offering to the community in its architecture, which shouldn't be lost as part of the retrofit. This is the survey inside. Obviously, local authorities don't have lots of records, they don't have the plans, so we use the LiDAR scanning to develop a really basic floor plan, which enables us to then do our retrofit assessment. So looking at all of the capacity and building services. Luckily, in Norwich, the community centres had all had three-phase electricity supply coming in, so they can all take air source heat pumps, which is great. So we don't have to do the assessment, because if we had to do utilities searches, that makes our process a lot heavier. This is talking about air changes and how we look at heat losses. I'm assuming everybody here knows the difference between infiltration and drafts, but I'm just going to leave that. We can talk about that later if that's something you'd like to chat about. But I'm going to talk about thermal models. So RDSAP and SAP are the standardised energy modelling software that's used in the retrofit sector, and it's rubbish. It's absolutely rubbish. On an estate-wide level, so when you're looking at about the estate, the 29,000 houses, it will be correct. On that level, it will be absolutely accurate. On a building by building level, it will not be able to predict you energy savings for the retrofit that you are installing. And it makes the justification of works really complicated when talking to clients and investors and the tenants who say, why should we spend this money? And you say, well, it will save you this. And then it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because the modelling software that was used to assess it is not right. The only way you can do it right is to use really dynamic software like IES. And the reason we don't use that is because it costs so much time and money to build the model that you've spent all the money you would have spent on retrofit building the model. So instead, we use simplified models. And of the two, so there's SAP, the one everybody uses, and the one that EPCs come out of, and PHPP, which is the alternative. And PHPP gets within 5 to 10% of predicted energy usage, where SAP can vary from anything from -50 to over 100% when it's estimating on a building by building level. So PHPP is definitely a winner. It's also allowed as a route through both PAS 2038 and PAS 2035. The only problem is Trustmark won't register them, so I'm having a fight with Trustmark about that at the moment, but we'll get to that later. So this is looking at individual elements of the community centres that we looked at: walls, roofs, floors, windows, envelope, looking at our building, looking at build-ups using PHPP to look at the actual U values, and looking at the LETI retrofit targets, and then looking what a standard target would be under Part L. So we've got all of this information for the client, where they stand, where they could target, and what's the basic. And then we put all of this, and this is what PHPP gives you. So this is what it looks like. Can you hear me if I stand away from the microphone?
Just for recording.
Oh, okay, fine. I'll not do that then. I just like to point. So these two, if you've not seen them before, are the energy balance graphs, and they're great. I find them really good as a discussive method. So you have where your building's losing energy, and you can see here that the building is losing 49.4 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year through the roof, and 56 through ventilation. So they're the big chunks on the left-hand side. And the bit on the right is where the energy is coming from into the building. So on this one, look at the heating demand. That is massive heating demand for this scale of building, because it's got very little solar gains, because the windows are tiny, and also because it's very lightly used, so it has very little internal gains. So that's what this is telling us. So we then mapped all of the community centres along the bottom, and we also put target rates to where they're performing against standardised buildings. So this was used for the client. This is a client-side diagram to help them to work out where to target their spend. So when they're, yeah, it's fine. I can stop at any point, it's fine.
One last thing.
Yeah, thank you. And so but then we look at the form factor, the heating load, and then the retrofit strategy for Norwich City Council is decarbonisation and minimum fabric improvements to get to a close to equal energy spend as you can. And so we test individual packages and measures using PHPP with a target of that yellow dotted line there, and look at ventilation, solar PV opportunities, and overheating, which is fine on this building. And that gets us to this amazing graph, which tells us there's your existing carbon usage, and those different lines are the different packages of measures that you could do to retrofit it, and what that leads to as a total cumulative carbon emission over the 60-year lifespan of which we standardly judge investment in buildings. And you can see, really interestingly, that the solar doesn't pay off. which is really interesting. So the way the green steps is with putting the solar on, because it's to do with the orientation of the building. It doesn't face true south enough for the solar to ever pay for itself in terms of carbon. Interestingly, it does in terms of cost, but not in terms of carbon. So it depends which your criteria are or against which you're judging. So there's our summary sheet, giving you all of that techie detail for anything you would need to know. And here it is summarised by community centre to enable our client to identify exactly where to spend the money and carbon that they have to make the best contribution to the community centres that they manage. Ta-da.
We've got about 20 minutes for Q&A, but just to kick off, a few things I'd like you to kind of say more on or just kind of reflect on a bit. And it was that point that I think you all spoke about, that kind of meeting of a community rep or member and the building expert. Whether that's the sort of meeting around language. Kyle, I think you said the term retrofit you don't like, so how do you kind of meet people with language, or how do you meet people like physically or through forums or through knowing the right people? Just a little bit more on that point, that sort of meeting of expert and community, if you don't mind. Yeah, I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the trust breakdown, because there's a really interesting piece of work that Norfolk Climate Change Partnership are doing about who still holds any gravitas in the world of retrofit and available funding. And there is still some evidence that local authorities are still one of the only people who have that trust in construction works, because the construction industry, as we all know, is pretty much unregulated. There is some regulation, but it's not something that community members would know or understand about. And so actually having the local authority as a lever, so enabling them to, and their communities teams to bring them to professional expertise is how we found that really useful. But it is through the lever of Norfolk Climate Change Partnership, who are one representative from each of the local authorities, who then interface with the professional community of the county.
Shall I just, I think that's great to hear that people still trust local authorities. That's not always what I've heard on the ground, let's say. And I think it's really difficult to build trust. You know, what do they say? You lose trust in, I don't know what the expression is. It's very easy to lose trust. It's very hard to build it back again. And I think we are in a kind of place in the world where people have lost trust in institutions pretty widely, actually. I think where we've seen success, it's about a layered approach, and it's about, so that might be, you know, a good experience with the repairs team, let's say, but that's about funding. So then you need to have a properly funded program of repairs and maintenance. It might be about knowledge, so really understanding why, let's call them home energy upgrades, are important and beneficial and what benefits they'll deliver. But I think it's very complicated to build that trust, and I think it needs a whole strategy, actually, of how you do that.
Pass it along. I guess this is a personal reflection, and one thing I've been thinking about, I sort of alluded to in the presentation since the beginning, is how we, and I appreciate that I work for like a relatively large organisation compared to lots of the, for example, sort of local architectural practices that might be engaging with some of these communities. But I feel that part of the need to set up a framework through which these larger organisations can engage with communities is to sort of embed that like quality assurance and the having an established framework, whatever it looks like, with a front door that a local community can go to and say, we need some support. We don't necessarily know exactly what it looks like at this point, but these are the challenges that we're facing. Having a kind of a front door that they know and recognise and is sort of relatively uniform looking, I sort of, my gut feeling is that would help to build confidence, at least, if not trust. I mean, trust is very much like a personal relationship thing, isn't it? But confidence that they would get the support that they needed, and I guess that's one of the things that I've been thinking about in the context of the work with Footwork.
Yeah, and I think I've noticed just more, what would you call them, a sort of community surgery, but with a focus on warm homes or energy saving, or kind of being advertised in local areas and local authorities. So maybe trying to, as you say, be the front door to access that knowledge and get started in a process that might lead from some of those, Hannah, in your slide, those initial things of just dealing with drafts, or, you know, the kind of steps up to the sort of full retrofit that maybe needed to bring some of those examples of the homes that are empty in Grimsby back to full reuse, right? So that kind of stage approach and advising communities appropriately and with good intentions and good knowledge. So let's open it up to the floor. I think my colleague Tom's got a roving mic. So if anyone's got a question, I will gently point and then Tom will give you the mic. Yes, gentleman at the front, Tom.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm an architect in North London, and I did do some work with some charities, and it seems to me that at the moment we have the situation, which is across the board and across the world, that when we have a title that says retrofit, what does it matter? Today, the discussion seemed to be on community, and what does community have to do with carbon? So my question is really what do we feel in our society that brings people together in terms to form these communities, because a lot of the times they don't necessarily have to have a heated space. They just need to have a place that they gather and they feel good. So how do we measure that?
Sorry, Ben, just to confirm the question. So are you asking what sorts of spaces do communities need, and how is what's carbon got to do with it, or?
In a sense, yes. What is, because when we hear of carbon, and we tend to think that this is about global warming and how our society is going to live through a time of unimaginable change. But we're going into very focused technical bits, and which are very important. But is it only? Can we put any other measure outside of a carbon footprint for our society?
I think there definitely is a different measure. I think that measure is a sociological measure. I think that measure is what communities mean. And there's much wider issues with the crisis of our communities and the crisis of spend and the crisis of disenfranchising of the community. But that doesn't mean we don't have to stop burning energy through the buildings. Like, they're two separate strands of a question, and actually the reason that we need to do it, as well as because it's the right thing to do and because we want our children to have a life nearly as good as the one that we have, it is that it's the law, because we have signed up to decarbonise by 2050, and so every public building, the social housing, the community centres, they all have to be decarbonised. So there are different levels of that. There's what we should do, there's a commentary on our current societal position, and then there's what we're having to do by legislation.
I think maybe the other thing I'd add to what Hannah is speaking on is also who is at the front line of this crisis. And a lot of the time it is communities who are in the poorest housing, are in the most flood-prone areas. I mean, they are the first to get hit. And I think that is a conversation in of itself. But if that is the case, what is the connection then between carbon, the global crisis, the global warming crisis, and their home, their livelihood is, I mean, we cannot disconnect them. They're so ingrained, they're so intertwined. And these spaces are what makes a good life. These spaces are security, they are warmth, they are safety. A lot of the time it is provision within our neighbourhoods where people who have been abused can feel safe and find the support that they need, where people who require emergency food can get that emergency food. So I think it's a question of who is at the front line of this crisis and how can we support them through that to respond to that crisis.
Okay.
I mean, I was just going to say a brief thing, which I think, in a way, your question encapsulates the whole problem, is that carbon is extremely abstract to most people, and actually in our daily life, I think most people would say in their daily lives, it doesn't really matter to them when you're dealing with, putting food on the table, and you're trying to get to work, when, I really agree with what Naomi's saying about often the impacts are on the people already in the most difficult situations. And so what we try and do when we talk to residents about retrofit is we don't actually focus massively on carbon. We talk about the issues. So we talk about damp and mould. We talk about cold rooms. We talk about comfort. We talk about health issues. We talk about cost. The point about retrofit is that it should be bringing, if you're doing it right, it should be bringing energy bills down. And those are the messages that resonate to people. And sure, I think, many people understand there is a climate crisis, but I think it can feel like a very hard thing to focus on when you've got all the other challenges. So I think really what we need to be is we need to be pragmatists and we need to take action. And if that means we have to message differently to frankly save the world, then fine, let's do it. But I think it's about understanding what resonates with people. And I don't personally think carbon is a very strong resonator. Other people may have things on that.
Yeah, I think you've just articulated very well, sort of similar to what I was going to say. But one of the points on my slides was about scaling outcomes. And I think if you go into a conversation and engage with communities about what the outcomes are that they want to achieve, then I suppose you probably will almost end up achieving that decarbonisation process by stealth, whether or not they realise that that's kind of what the technical outcome, one of the technical outcomes is, that will be delivered at the same time. And I just take this quick moment to plug something that we're doing with the National Retrofit Hub at the moment, actually, which is there's a working group on monitoring outcomes and impact evaluation. And the whole purpose of that is to try to not necessarily quantify, but better articulate what all of these outcomes are. And it's open to everybody to come along and join in and share their insights. So if that's something that you'd be open to doing, that would be really welcome. But so that we can then think about how not only do you drive the uptake of retrofit, but also, as a couple of people have alluded to, think about how that starts to attract and underpin private finance and investment in that space as well.
Great. Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, Alistair at the back.
Hi, thanks very much. Alistair from Collective Works. I actually asked this last week, so I'm very sorry for anyone who was here last week, but I got some great answers. Retrofit can be very technical, but it also has a very human side, as a lot of you have kind of suggested. I'm interested to know who your retrofit heroes are. Who are the kind of unspoken people who are doing a lot of the work, or the protagonists in the communities, or the people who need to be on TV more, basically? Like, who would you think, who's the hero we need in retrofit, and who would you nominate? I'd love to hear. Thank you. Before
you answer, Alistair, you're making notes on all of these? Yes, okay, great. Who's going to go first?
I I'm going to go back to what I just said about the National Retrofit Hub. I think in particular the co-directors there, Sarah Edmonds and Rachel I have confused. It is Rachel Owens. There's two Rachels at the National Retrofit Hub. Yeah. I always email the wrong one. And Rachel Owens are doing amazing things in just that sort of convening space and recognising that none of us can solve this on our own, and it's going to take collaboration, and that is what they're all about. And so yeah, they're my heroes.
Oh man, this is a really hard question. Okay, I'm just going to pick 4 London ones, because we're all in London. Okay, so I'd go with Len the Mechanic in Haggerston Archers. I'd go with Paulette Singer of Clitterhouse Farm. I'd go with Danny Gilbert of Good Shepherd Studio in Leytonstone. And I'd go with Lenny, who is on site in Catford, of Sister Midnight Community Venues, which is a mammoth of a renovation, retrofit, repair, re-life, reborn project. And she's always up for a chat. And in fact, she might even be here for the session with National Retrofit Hub in early June. So phenomenal community asset, renovators, retrofitters, repairers. There's so many more, but I'll just stop there.
This is a really hard question. I've got 2 different ones at different ends of the scale. So one is the moderator on the Architects Action Network Existing Buildings Forum, because that is such such an amazing resource, because everybody's trying to learn the same things at the same time, and we're all taking a while to get up because it's a different way of thinking about buildings. And in fact, the fact that these little moderated groups, like little WhatsApp groups, exist, which enable people to share the things they're thinking, the things they've learned, it's the same as the National Retrofit Hub, but at a very geeky level. So I would big up them. And then the second one is the Centre for Alternative Technology, who've been talking about this for generations, and they just kept at it. They kept at it and kept at it until the world realised they were right. And I just think kudos to them and all of the graduates who have come out of there over the years, and all of the thinkers who put their time in.
Yeah, maybe I'm dodging the question because I think I might be a bit anti-hero. I think, and it's quite interesting the range of answers that everybody else has given, and I am going to dodge the question and say that I think retrofit is about system change fundamentally, and I think actually leadership is really important and bringing people together is important, but I'm not sure that I would frame that as heroics. I think where you're seeing success, and been some great examples mentioned, actually it's about people coming together and almost being anti-heroes in a way. It's not people at ACAN, an amazing organisation, people are not sort of standing up and claiming responsibility for that. That is all about what we can do if we work together as a group. The National Retrofit Hub is all about what we can do if we work together as groups, and there are people that speak for those I don't know if organisations, collectives maybe is the right word, but I think that framing is really important, that we don't have to be heroes, we just have to do something. And I think that's what I would say about it. Anything that we can.
Harder for Alistair to note take, though.
True, sorry, Alistair.
Okay, brilliant answers, brilliant question. Any more questions? Oh, it's gentleman at the front, Tom.
I'm Chris from a company called Quantum with my colleagues. We've got 2 businesses. One, we're a retrofit and renewables contractor. And we're also a training company. So a couple of things that come out of the fantastic speeches. One is, what do you think of some of the schemes that are out there, where if you are you've done a short course, level 5, you're smiling already. You've done a level 5 retrofit assessor course, and you're working under, say, the Eco 4 scheme. Quite a few people. I think that's one. You go to someone's house and you've got to do all what you professionals have discussed, the right things to do. Data-driven, which is the right way it should be. Decide on, if you've got X amount of money to spend on that property, what are you going to do? Yeah, you can't do it all. What do you think about those schemes? Because some of those are horror stories, and that work is not being, the quality control on that, those contractors, is not being released. But lots of money, millions being thrown at it. They're not achieving what we want to achieve. And also as well, in terms of like the, being it community driven, which is the best way in my opinion. The Beacon Tree Estate, we installed lot, and the Department of Further Education have put a lot of money out there for colleges. So we're very keen on trying to bridge the green skills gap with youngsters and people through boot camps, because retrofit is sort of a multi-skilled trade. The Beacon Tree Estate, we've got a big training facility in Barking and Dagenham College, and they asked us to look at a house on the estate. They were going to do a sort of a JV with the council and the college, and it was going to be for, and it was with Be First. Yeah. So I met the environmental engineer there from Be First. She was really pleasant, really knew her stuff. It was like 5 months ago. Yeah. But the whole idea of that house, obviously, is like that's how you get the. If you do a great job on that, first class, and you show the energy savings, the whole community then, it's easy, isn't it? It's taken to it.
So,
no?
Yeah. So just to kind of try and consolidate
so
that.
2 questions there. What do you
Yeah.
think about these current schemes, getting the work done, with level 5 assessors going out there, a bit like people that are doing EPC certificates from their cars, you know?
It's really hard. It's really hard. It's trying to upskill a lot of people really quickly, and we have to believe that it's doable, because otherwise no one does anything. But the truth is, it's really hard. And some things you put on buildings are really easy. I mean, I'm sure you know about it, like solar panels and roofs. It's not so hard. Like, you can assess the roof. As long as the roof's got the capacity, it can go on. As soon as you get more 2 or 3 combined fabric measures, the interdependencies of those are complicated, and you have to have at least a basic understanding of building physics isn't going to cut it, basically, and that's why you end up with mould, and you end up with the ventilation not compensating for the issues we are going to start happening in this country with overheating are unreal. Using PHPP, they do climate stress modelling. So looking at the social houses that we've been modelling, even without additional retrofit measures, you're getting to up to 15% overheating. That's called catastrophic under PHPP, and that's without any additional measures. If you're then adding external wall insulation and you're not using a low, can never remember the word, where you slow down the transfer of energy, whatever that word is. If you're just using a fast transfer insulative material, you're going to be making houses uninhabitable. So it's really hard, but we have to learn, and to learn, things have to move forward, and that's the issue.
There's no funding for air-to-air heat pumps, which will, they've been like 100 years. I mean, people think of it as air conditioning, but it is heating as well. So there's no funding for that.
I mean, maybe what you're also identifying is like a bigger, more macro issue here, which I think is about how funding works for retrofit, and that's probably the subject of another
We've
talk.
got an event on funding.
So I won't go into it too much, but I think there is a lot of, my experience has been there's a lot of waste in the system at the moment, and things like funding deadlines do make it quite hard to operate efficiently, and what you can spend the funding on is difficult. You know, if it's just capital works, not all of the kind of planning and the retrofit coordinator work that needs to go alongside that, or the strategic thinking, or employing, for local authorities, employing team members to actually client that work. That's really difficult. I mean, Lodge Avenue is a bit of a example of that. Don't know how much I can say about that with a microphone in my hand, but
we're running out of time as well, Kyle. So
shut up then.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I think because it is just after 7:30, we will wrap up. So I'm not going to take any more questions, but there is a bit of time to talk to the panelists and talk to each other. So we will be closing the building at 8:00. So I'm going to thank all of our panelists. So thank you to Naomi, to Helena, to Kyle, and to Hannah. Could we show our appreciation? Thank you. And thank you all for coming this evening. As I say, you can spend some time looking around the exhibition if you want. We've got an event next Wednesday evening on the topic of hearts and minds. As I said before, the whole Retrofit 25 programme is very much on this systems sort of approach and thinking and change that we need. So all of those various topics we'll be covering throughout the season. So do check out the Building Centre website and book for those. And we'll have webinars coming up as well. So we hope to see you again soon. And yeah, our panellists will be going upstairs. So if you want to have a little chat with them, please make your way upstairs. Thanks again.